I have spent the past 15 years studying the power of empathy to transform our lives, our relationships, our workplaces, and even the world. One day, something really special happened to me to cement my belief that empathy is our superpower. Here's what happened. It was about 15 years ago. I was in the long lineup to send a parcel during the holiday season, and nobody had cell phones to distract us, so the 30 minutes that it took to get to the counter felt really long. When I got to the counter, the woman who greeted me was rude. Not just having a bad day rude, like aggressive rude. And I remember my first reaction was to call her out on it. But around that time, I was studying the neuroscience of empathy and that we could become more empathic with practice. So I took a breath and I looked at her and I asked, "Are you okay?" There was this little pregnant pause when she was trying to determine whether I was being passive-aggressive or sarcastic, and she realized I was being sincere. She burst into tears. She said to me, "I have been working double shifts for 2 weeks straight. My son is at home with a fever, and I think I'm getting sick. And it's 3 in the afternoon. I haven't even had a lunch break. I'm just so exhausted." 10 seconds earlier, I really didn't like the woman. But then I found myself reaching across the counter, holding her hands, both of us with tears streaming down our cheeks. That is empathy. And empathy is our superpower. So what is this word empathy? We hear it floating around all the time. What does empathy mean to you? When I speak to audiences, I'll ask that question. And the 3 categories of answers I get are as follows. First, they'll think empathy is stepping into someone else's shoes. Great. Second, I also hear empathy is seeing through someone else's eyes, which is another great answer. And typically third, I'll hear empathy is feeling what someone else is feeling. Again, those are all super answers to the question, what does empathy mean to you? But after having spent 15 years studying empathy, I want to share the top 10 things that I've learned. And that's what this video is all about. So the first thing to know about empathy is that I actually situate it on a continuum. So on one side is pity, followed by sympathy, next is compassion, and then empathy. And on the pity side of the equation, there's power asymmetry embedded in the relationship. When you pity someone, you are looking down on them, you poor person. And unfortunately, there's research that shows the higher up you climb in any kind of organizational structure, or the more resources, power, or money that you accrue in society, the less likely you are to empathize. So we really want to mitigate against this pity paradigm. Now, as you make your way across the continuum to empathy, that's where things get really interesting. Because the way I define empathy, the working definition I use, is that empathy is the innate trait that unites us in our common humanity. So we all share things like love, joy, shame, disappointment. Those are human emotions that unite us in our common humanity. And empathy allows that to happen. But there's one really important caveat, and that is that we don't deny or discount lived experiences. So even though we can share the human emotions, the wide variety of human emotions that exist in the world, we don't want to project our feelings onto someone else. We have to be really, really careful to guard against that so that you're listening with empathy without projection. The second thing to know about empathy is that it's actually made up of 2 phenomena. The first is affective empathy, and the second is cognitive. Let me talk about each one at a time. So affective empathy happens to us. It's engaging our emotions thanks to our mirror neurons, right? So when you watch a child outside play, you might put a smile on your face. When you see somebody stub their toe, you might wince. So I'm going to invite you to take a look at the screen. I'm going to put 2 images up, and I want you to pay attention to what happens to your face. Here's the first image. Now notice what's happening to your face. I bet your cheekbones are up, the sides of your mouth are starting to twirl up in a little smile, and that is because your mirror neurons are firing, right? When you see an image like this child who's happy and gleeful, you feel the same. Your mirror neurons are firing in emotional resonance. Now, let's look at image number 2. Here it would be almost impossible, unless you're a bona fide psychopath, to hold your smile, right? Your cheekbones probably lowered, you lost the smile on your face because this child is obviously in pain. Now this is happening once again because we have what's known as mirror neurons that are firing so that we feel what somebody else is feeling as we are exposed to the stimulus of sadness or happiness or fear. It's called emotional contagion. And that is essentially the compassion piece. Remember I mentioned the continuum, there's pity, sympathy, and compassion, followed by empathy. Compassion is feeling what someone else is feeling. The second form of empathy is cognitive empathy, and that is really perspective taking. So when you're sitting with somebody who's telling you a story about what's going on in their life, and you're imagining what that experience is like for them, or you're imagining what it would feel like to be in their situation, that is cognitive empathy, and it's you making the decision to empathize in that way. Cognitive empathy also happens when you're reading great fiction or watching a fantastic movie, when you enter the characters and the lives of the characters. We're engaged in cognitive empathy, perspective taking, and that is a choice, which is why I believe that cognitive empathy provides us full potential because we can decide to lean into it. Let's take a look at this. You see these three dogs, they all have different personalities, different moods. You can see it based on their facial expression and their body language, right? I bet you if I asked you to choose the puppy on the left, that you could discern what kind of mood he or she is in. And if he could speak, what would he say? I ask this of my audiences all the time, and typically I get, a variety of answers, but they're all within sort of one domain. The mood of the dog is happy, the mood of the dog is sad, the mood of the dog is curious, right? I bring this to your attention only because we have the capacity for cognitive empathy, but it's not a perfect science. We'll read into facial expressions and body language and sort of tone of voice based on how we feel. Are we hungry? Are we lonely? Are we missing someone? Do we have a headache? So cognitive empathy is something we're capable of, but we also have to be discerning. The third thing to know about empathy is that we are born with the innate capacity almost straight out of the womb. And there's a special thing that happens when we are 3 months old. So I want to tell you a story about what happened with me and my 3-month-old daughter. Please don't judge me when I tell you the story. It's only, I think, kind of interesting because I'm an empathy researcher. So I was out with my daughter, she was in a stroller, in a perfectly good mood, late summer day. And we were walking, and then we came and crossed paths with another mom and a child in a stroller who was having a full-blown meltdown. Now, just as my daughter and I passed the mom and her son, my daughter noticed him and burst spontaneously into tears. And I was so happy to see it happen because that's exactly when empathy shows up as emotional contagion. So remember, empathy is innate to us and we hit different developmental pathways throughout our life. Number 4, empathy has been part of our successful evolution as a species. So let's roll back. 40 or 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were not alone on the planet. We were sharing the planet with 4 or 5 other large brain species. But we are the only ones who survived. Now, why is that? Evolutionary scientists who have studied why we survived have come to the conclusion that empathy played a huge role. Now, they've looked at our body and how our body changed over time, and they realized that unlike those other creatures that died off, most of our hair, especially our facial hair, fell off, relatively speaking. Our testosterone dropped, relatively speaking, and the most interesting thing to me at least is that the whites of our eyes grew really, really big. Why is that important? Well, so that we could read each other's facial expressions, especially read into each other's eyes across distances so that we could collaborate together and fight the elements. But empathy, the idea of understanding what somebody is feeling in order to collaborate, was essential to our survival as a species. Number 5, if we travel back 10 million years ago, we can trace our shared lineage with chimpanzees and bonobos. So here's what a chimpanzee looks like, and here's what a bonobo looks like. And what I found super interesting is that we humans share more DNA in common with chimps and more DNA in common with bonobos than they share with each other. All right. Now, the story that exists in our society about human nature is the chimp story. And that is that we are hierarchical by nature, prone to violence, open warfare. But it turns out if we'd been studying bonobo culture for as long as we've studied chimpanzee culture, we would have a totally different conception of what it means to be human and what is part of our human nature. Because, according to Frans de Waal, who is a primatologist who spent 40 years studying bonobo culture, bonobos are loving by nature, and tender by nature, and kind by nature. And so I believe the chimpanzee story that's circulating deserves some airplay, but the bonobo story is what we need to be leaning into. We all know from our personal lives when we've helped each other out and we've been there for each other, it's very much part of who we are. So let's try to remember the bonobo in us. Number 6, we can become more empathic with practice. So just like you go to the gym and you do some bicep curls and you grow your biceps, we can actually on purpose become more empathic with practice. In fact, there's a researcher at Stanford by the name of Jamil Zaki who has studied that even believing that you can become more empathic has an impact in a positive direction on how you behave. Now, how does it work for us to become more empathic with practice? Well, it's thanks to our brain plasticity, our neural plasticity. Let me explain how it works. So here's an image of the inside of our brain, and you'll see a lot of synaptic connections. Some are really, really tiny little threads, and others are much thicker. The thin threads represent thoughts that we have very seldom, whereas the thick synaptic connections are the thoughts and behaviors that we repeat on a regular basis. So just like I was saying at the gym, if you go to the gym and you work out your muscles and you're really happy with the results, we can become more empathic by thinking more empathic thoughts, behaving in more empathic ways. It becomes also a self-fulfilling prophecy where we feel the good results of being more empathic in our lives. Number 7 is that empathy feels good to our brains. Now, you remember the story that I was telling you at the beginning about meeting this woman who was really rude to me? And I asked her, "Are you okay?" And then she shared with me what was going on in her life. And we found ourselves holding hands across the counter in what I call an empathic embrace. Now, in that moment, if an fMRI machine was monitoring my brain activity, we would have seen that the pleasure and reward centers of my brain were lit up. Just like what happens when we're eating a delicious piece of chocolate cake, or we're high on psychedelics, or we're enjoying some post-coital bliss. Turns out that empathy feels so good to our brain that it lights up the pleasure and reward centers, just like all of those hedonic experiences that we love so much. Number 8, not only does empathy feel good to our brains, it feels terrific to our bodies. Our bodies go through a whole host of physiological changes when we're locked in that empathic embrace or when we're feeling an emotional resonance with someone. So for starters, all of the stress hormones like cortisol that go floating through in our bodies when we are feeling a sense of urgency or a sense of anxiety, they all get replaced by the feel-good hormones like serotonin and oxytocin, the kind of hormones that allow us to feel connection and social bonding. And as a result of that, our breathing changes. Instead of shallow breathing, we do much more deeper breathing, which of course then has an impact on our immune system and how it functions. So even our immune system functions better when we're feeling emotionally connected to someone. So empathy feels good to our brains, it feels good to our bodies, except when we hit empathy fatigue. And we know that experience when we've just given so much of ourselves. We've taken care of everybody else's needs and we haven't recharged our batteries. We're feeling really low ourselves. We are depleted emotionally. That's when we're on the on-ramp for burnout. So we have to be really careful to guard against that. We want to amplify and extend empathy to the full capacity without actually crossing that empathy fatigue threshold. Number 9. I want to talk about 2 limits to empathy. So the first one we just talked about, which is at empathy fatigue. So what happens if you pass that threshold of empathy fatigue, right? It's now a matter of recharging your own battery. So I want to share a really simple and effective practice. All you do is you rub your hands together until they feel a degree of warmth or even heat, and you put them on your chest. I want you to do this with me. Rub your hands. Put them on your chest and take a nice long deep breath and tell yourself, today I did the best I could. Or right now, I'm doing the best I can. So you can do this in the middle of the day, nobody needs to know you're doing it, or you can do it multiple times at the end of the day while you're laying in bed. It's a chance for you to recharge your batteries and give yourself some self-empathy. The other limitation to empathy that I want to talk about is othering. That's a fancy way of saying you are different from me and therefore I have less empathy for you. Now, as species, we developed that way to other, right? There was this in-group and then there was the out-group. And it continues to this day where we empathize more with people who are like us, who eat like us, look like us, vote like us. But the idea of extending empathy is to actually get beyond the othering so that we extend our empathy outbound to the largest circle of people we possibly can. And one of the best ways to practice humanizing other people is a simple act of eye gazing. So this is what I invite you to do. Find a willing participant in your home or at the office or a friend, and it just involves 2 minutes of your life. Essentially what you do is you stand facing each other and you turn on your phone with a timer of 30 seconds. And you make sure that you stand in an open stance. You shake off your hands and put them on the side. You make sure your feet are not crossed. And you hit the phone for 30 seconds of simple eye gazing. Sounds simple, but it's actually much harder than you think because it requires a fair bit of vulnerability. So when you're doing it, first of all, it's not a staring competition. And the only real rule is that there's no speaking. What may end up happening is you might have some giggles or your partner might have some giggles. If that happens, just ignore it. Don't judge it. It's not a big deal. And after the 30-second timer goes off, you shake off your nerves and you might talk to each other for a second about how that felt. Next step is you set a timer for 90 seconds. And you enter a longer eye-gazing experiment where it's really important to take some big, deep breaths. You breathe up through your nose and out through your mouth, and you let it go all the way down your body, out through the earth. And you give yourself permission to be seen, and you give yourself permission to really see your partner. When I do this, even in the corporate environments where there's, suits and stiffness, people are hugging, people are weeping. It's a beautiful, beautiful experience, and it's an opportunity for you to practice humanizing your partner and extending beyond the other. Number 10, let's focus on purposeful empathy. I've talked a lot about how we're born with the capacity to empathize. We can become more empathic with practice. We can lean into it and turn up the volume of empathy in our lives and feel better. Our brains feel better, all of that. I want to talk specifically about purposeful empathy because it's connected to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, you might remember from an intro to psychology class that little diagram of a triangle where when our baseline needs of, let's say, food and shelter and then belonging get met, the highest level of human achievement is what he called self-actualization. That is becoming all that we're able and capable of becoming, achieving our full potential. But just before he died, he realized that his own model was limited because, in fact, he came to see that the full potential is achieved when we are in a moment of self-transcendence. What does that mean? It means being of service to others and being of service to something greater than ourselves. Purposeful empathy, the idea of empathizing and opening up the concentric circles to empathize with more people, more broadly, allows us to achieve self-transcendence. And that's what I want for you. I believe that empathy is our superpower. And when you lean into it and turn up the volume of empathy in your life, guess what's going to happen? You'll start to feel better. You'll be healthier and happier. Your mental health will improve. Your relationships will improve. Your workplace will be positively impacted. And yes, empathy at a collective level can change the world. So I believe empathy is our superpower. I also believe it's your superpower. The world needs more empathy. And if you're ready to elevate your life using the power of empathy, let's go on this journey together.